myself. My name is Resty Tammy.
And my name is Nisrina Deliza.
My name is Tita Oktavia.
My name is Husni Mubarok.
In this video, we will presentate and then we will explain about interpreting. Let's enjoy.
Interpreting, or better known as interpretation, is a linguistic and social act of communication where there is a process of rendering a message from the source language to another language, target language of the speaker, or speaker with the spoken language on the spot.
So the next is role of interpreting. So the role of interpreting is a social science construct to explain behavior and examine attitude between at least two participants in any of social situation. According to Poxnecker 2004, stated that the interpreters is not only translating the meaning but also as a messenger, guide, and negotiator for helping communication, and also as a bridge communication in another language to another language. So if we compare with the other professional role, that we have a status differential between the clients and the interpreters. That means the clients are honorable, and we have to deal with the expectation of the client because they paying us. And then the translating versus interpreting. Interpreting usually called as a subtitles that use in a live performance, while translating usually called subtitles that use in film and video.
And then we have modes of interpreting. In an interpreting, there are also some modes that usually use depends on what the interpreting session they have. The first one is simultaneous interpreting. Simultaneous interpreting is the mode of interpreting in which the interpreter renders the message that being delivered by a speaker into another language with a minimal time lag or even at the same time. In the simultaneous mode, interpreters generally work in soundproof booths, listen via headphones, and then spoken the message into microphone. Next is consecutive interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is when interpreters listening to client's speech while taking notes. When the speaker has finished, then the interpreter would rendering the message into target language. Next is whispered interpreting. This type of interpreting is used by whispering, so the interpreter would convey to the target language by whispering. Next is bilateral interpreting. Bilateral interpreting referred where the interpreter uses two languages to interpret for two or more people. This type of interpreting is usually used in informal situations like business meeting or for community interpreting. Next is side interpreting. Simply, side interpreting is interpret from text to spoken form. Seems like read a text from the source language to the target language. Next is telephone interpreting. It's interpreting session through a phone, and this type of interpreting usually used in USA. Next is sign interpreting. Sign interpreting is provided for deaf people, so the interpreters would use sign language to interpret the message.
Next, process interpreter in process. Example, Matsgar 1995, Roy 1989, Wensjo 1992, and 1998. They have demonstrated that interpreters are involved in negotiation, such things as who has the turn, asking for clarification, prompting a response, or turn from a primary party, explaining what one party or another means, or explaining that one participant does not understand the another because The two primary speakers in interpreters even do not know the other's language. The interpreter is the only participant who can logically maintain, adjust, and if necessary, refer difference in structure and use. Typical, the interpreter is the only one that know or can actually use the conventional or discourse strategies of both language. This means that the interpreter is active third participant who can influence both the direction. This means that the interpreter is an active third participant who can influence both the direction and outcome of the event and the event itself in intercultural and interpersonal rather than simple mechanical and technical.
So the code ethics of interpreters is procedure guideline for being good interpreters. There are an 8 code ethics of interpreting for interpreters. The first is accuracy and fidelity. That means that the interpreters must do their best to interpret the message to all of the parties without addition, omission, or embellishment the meaning. Example, using grammatical tone and gesture, same with the client. Number 2 is confidentiality. That means that the interpreter will not disclose all of the information, either written, spoken, or seen into outside. Example, there will advises to all of the parties about confidentiality and required to collaborative work with other interpreters. The third is impartiality. The interpreter should not take side when doing interpreting, also should not told advices and express personal interesting. Example, they are must declines interpret when have personal interest and declines interpret when their relationship with the client or parties will affect the accident or conflict. The fourth is respect per person. That means that interpreters must respect to all of the parties. Example, they will demonstrate the request and promote direct communication. The fifth is maintaining role boundaries. The interpreters stay with the role and refrain from personal involvement. Example, they enable to communicate between parties, do not enter discussion, give advice and personal opinion, and do not filter communication. Number 6 is accountability, as the interpreter must responsible for their interpreting and responsible to all parties. Example, they have to correct the errors, declines assignment beyond their capacity, and the obligation and transparency. The seventh is professionalism. That means that the interpreters always act professional and ethical manners. Example, they wear appropriate dress and complete their assignment, arrives early and remains the appointed location, make a working environment conducive, and doesn't conduct personal business. The eighth is continue competence. That means that the interpreters must always develop their knowledge about language, individuals, attitude, and service, how to treat the client. Example, they have to obtain and demonstrate their accreditation or certification, maintain and expand skill in knowledge. They have to ask feedback and evaluative for their skills and develop their knowledge.
Interpreter in mental health.
A mental health interpreter is an interpreter working in mental health setting. The setting include not only emergency, treatment, and rehabilitation setting, but also setting in which the client is identified as a mental health client. When communication involves two or more language and culture, psychiatric assessment and mental health treatment present additional complexities which must be considered and addressed by the professional team, including the interpreter. For the interpreter, this challenge can be divided into the three areas. The first is Section A, linguistic consideration. Mental health professionals depend heavily on language form and content for diagnosis and treatment. Nuances in communication, including affected tone and subtitles of language structure, may be significant for diagnosis and treatment. Section B, contextual dimension. To perform effectively in this setting, interpreters require knowledge about the diversity of mental health care environment, including the goal and norm of specific setting and intervention. Interpreters should be familiar with the types of mental health professionals who are present in various settings, their roles, their communication goals, and their treatment methodologies. Section C, interpersonal dynamics. It is essential that interpreter possess personal and psychological strength necessary to be effective in mental health work, along with the ability to consistently and critically assess one's skill and the impact of one's behavioral and translation decision.
Next, definition legal setting. Interpreting in the legal setting is finding out what is done when speakers of different language have to communicate in a legal setting. The culture of this legal system creates substantial interpretation difficulties. For competent resolution, court interpreters must be well versed in the legal terminology. The role of the court interpreter is to enable communication between speakers of different language. A courtroom interpreter has ethical responsibilities that must be met. And modes of legal setting, there are three. First, simultaneous interpreting. Second, consecutive interpreting. And last, sign interpreting. And interpreting in specialist legal setting area of work, there are five. First, staffing a legal matter. At a minimum, 2 interpreters are typically required for most legal assignments because legal assignments are generally more complex. And second, potential risks. Certain legal assignments such as law enforcement interpreting pose great risk for the interpreter who may be called as a witness later to defend their work in the interpreter assignment. Number 3, preparation. The interpreter is ethically obligated to prepare for a assignment, particularly legal and a court assignment. And number 4, court interpreter. Court interpreters have specific duties prior to interpreting the official proceeding. Court interpreters may participate in limited way in a legal proceeding, for example, to take the oath to interpret accurately, to present their qualification for the record, to respond to a challenge to the accuracy of the interpretation, to inform the court of an error and seek permission to ask the witness for reparation or clarification. And last, code of ethics. Legal interpreters adhere to a code of ethics that governs their professional conduct. Ethical guidelines include principles of impartiality, confidentiality, accuracy, and professionalism.
Business interpreting. There are several things that you should know about business interpreting. The first one is definition. In the context of interpreting, business interpretation refers to any environment or situation where business-related communication takes place. The type of interpreting that usually used in business interpreting is simultaneous, consecutive, whispering, or sometimes telephone interpreting. In the interpreting context, The interpreters are required to have broad knowledge and mastery of the language. The interpreters also have to prepared. They need assessment, which means they do a mini research about the language or duration of the session and also find relevant information or supporting materials. Maintain confidential and professionalism. The interpreter often faced by some cultural or ambiguous idioms that may never heard. It can also be challenged when the speakers talk in a rapid speed, where the interpreter must maintain the pace and convey the message accurately. And there are also some difference between business interpreting with the other interpretings. What really makes the difference is the context, subject matter, cultural matters, and the ethical standards. In business setting, the context is on business area while the subject is industry and commerce. Legal setting context is on court or legal session area and the subject is proceeding legal system. Mental health context is on mental or health setting with psychological or emotional issues as a subject. Lastly is interpreting, where the purpose is to ensure accurate and clear communication between the interviewer and the interviewee.
The definition of interviewed interpreting. Interviewed interpreting is an activity where another language is being transferred to the another language in the interview process and involving the interviewer, the interviewee, and the language interpreter. And the definition of interpreter in interviewed interpreting. Interpreter in interview is a person who acts as a language interpreter between two or more languages in order to helping the participant to communicate in the interviewing process who have a language barrier. And then also there is an example of interviewed interpreting where the requirement process need an interpreter for helping the communication between the participant who not share the common language. And then for the interpreter interview, there is a few qualification. So according to the book of Kabale 1996, the interviewer or the client has their own standard to hire the interpreter to work with them. So ideally, the interpreter should qualify the qualification requirements provided by the interview or the interviewer or the client. And then the qualification itself is depend on the on each interviewer who will hire the interpreter. And there are some of the basic qualification for the interpreter, which is the first one is having insight to the theme of the interview and then being able to do something informational conversation about the topic in order to helping the conversation between the interviewer and the interviewee. And it is better if the language interpreter is a native or has a cultural background in that country, so that they are much more fluent in interpreting the communication between interviewer and interviewer. This is also because there is a possibility where the interviewee is using dialect for the communication, and it will be difficult to understand if the interpreter is not having a same cultural background. And there is some stages in interpreting process. So the first one is preparation, where in this stage there will be a briefing session between the interpreting and then the interviewer, and the interviewer might be giving the interpreter guideline for the interview process. And then after going through the briefing process, during the beginning of the interview, the interviewer will open up the conversation by introducing you as an interpreter, but also in some cases there is interpreter that introducing by themselves. And during the interview session, the interviewer will talk directly facing the interviewee, and the interpreter will stay beside the interviewee or the interviewer. So the position or the formation, it will be like triangle. In general, the type of interpreting that will be used is consecutive interpreting, where the position of the interpreter and the all participant is in the same room. And then after the interview session is over, there will be a discussion for the interpreter performance during the interview process.
That's all from us. I hope you guys have a good insight from our presentation. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.